So welcome to our ninth dialogue in the Imagining Future series. And today what we're going to hear about is the commemoration of sites and narratives that have difficult and also unfinished pasts. And we might want to discuss in the final sessions about what is meant by unfinished pasts and are pasts ever finished. And we have a pleasure of hearing about these difficult subjects from Elizabeth Kyazike, supported by Abiti Adebo-Nelson, and responding to them will be Mick Finch. And then we'll go on to Hawa Mkwela, and responding to her will be Elizabeth Wright. And I'll start with just brief introductions about our wonderful colleagues, which these are very short because their lives are multiple and complex, but it'll give you a sense of the kind of things they do. So Dr. Elizabeth Kyazike is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Kyambogo University in Uganda, where she's also the Dean of Faculty of the Arts and the Humanities. Her research has centered on the Kansiore phenomena, which is a group of delayed return hunter-gatherers. Elizabeth is also doing great groundbreaking work in Uganda as a development archaeologist, which incorporates sensitive documenting of memories. And it is her expertise and findings on these in relation to documenting the memories of slavery and the slave trade that we're going to hear about today. And her colleague that has been supporting her on this project is Abiti Adebo-Nelson, who is a curator for ethnography and history at the Uganda National Museum. And he's currently writing a history PhD at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. And his research focuses on community memorials, restitution, ethnographic museums, and transitional justice. And responding to them will be Mick Finch, who is currently professor in visual art practice at Central St. Martin's, following some 20 years of making, exhibiting, and teaching in France, which began with painting and moved towards increasing use of image mediation and projection. As part of his arts and research practice, he leads the AHRC-funded project, A Vision for Europe, Academic Responsibility and Action in Times of Crises, in collaboration with the Warburg Institute and the Bildfahrzeuge Research Group. He's also working in T-Factor and EU Horizon 2020 project, which is rethinking the way we make cities and paradoxes therein, addressing the need for new urban regeneration models and tools. And our first presentation will be on the unarchived horrors of slavery at Fort Patiko, rethinking the historical narratives of slavery and slave trade in the post-conflict northern Uganda. Elizabeth, I give you the floor, and I will share your presentation. Okay, give me 1 second.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Our presentation is mainly centered on archiving the memories of slavery at Fort Patiko. We are working with Nelson Abiti, who unfortunately, I'm not sure, might not join because he traveled to the UK. I request that you take me to the third slide because the bios have already been presented, and yet we have really limited time. Why did we think about Fort Patiko as the main theme in which we are fitting in of archiving the unarchived pasts? When you look at many of the documentation that is in the archives in Uganda, you realize that it is mainly focusing on documenting the lives and stories of the prominent people. So that's why we thought that possibly looking at the memories of the slaves or slavery and slave trade at Fort Patiko will give us another side of the story of those who did not have chance to have their story archived. Fort Patiko is situated in Uchuchi Hills currently, which is in Gulu district, and it was used by two different groups of people, mainly those were the Arabs and then the British. But starting with the Arabs, who were mainly participating in this slave trade, they used this as a store, as we shall see later on in some of the structures that are on the site. They were using it as a store to store some of their merchandise, and partly this included the slaves. And at this point, it was also used like sort of as a center where they would exchange the slaves, all those who were captured from different parts of Uganda. And then later on, they would sort those that would be transported to other areas, especially in the Equatorial Province. It is known as Fort Patiko or Sir Samuel Baker Port because this port is said to have been built as a fort by Sir Samuel Baker, and it has two different kinds of pronunciation, sometimes called Fatiko or Patiko, but we look at the life of Sir Samuel Baker, especially at Fort Patiko from 1872 to 88. The same port was used by other leaders of the Equatorial Province, including Emin Pasha and Charles Gordon. In 1972, this area or this fort was declared a historical monument for Uganda. So that's why we look at it basically from 1872 up to 1972, we find that it becomes a monument. But you're saying, how do we archive, how do we tell the story of this part of heritage, which is a dark kind of heritage, a hurting heritage, and at the same time, use it to heal the wounds of people, since Northern Uganda has gone so much, next slide please, has gone so much through war as unlike other parts of Uganda. So we came up with objectives, and one of them is to document these memories of slavery and slave trade in an area which has been affected by war. Look at the architectural structure of the site and how are they used, what stories do people have about them, and then how are the slaves got all the way from the time of capture up to the time of sending them outside Uganda. And especially you see how music has been used as a healing tool in this area. Next slide, please. And in doing this, we used a number of methods. And so this part of our methodology, we collected primary data from many oral narratives, as we're going to hear from the people in the area. We also looked at the performances and looked at the meaning and how these performances are used, especially on the side of music. Many focus group discussions. We observed what people are doing currently and also collected archival data. We did archaeological survey to find out some of the remains at the site, if we could get traces of remains that would relate to slave trade, and drone surveys to map the site, as we shall see in the pictures, in addition to secondary data. Next, please. So as a result of the field work that was carried out, all the red points we see here in this stretch shows the areas that were mapped during our surveys on this site. And so this marks sort of the boundaries of the site. It should be noted that on the site, there's a trench which could not easily be captured even through the pictures, but through this mapping with the GPS, we were able to do that. Next slide, please. So in examining one of our first objective, what memories do people have about slave trade within this area? We find that if we sum them up, we find that people have memories concerning the Arabs and the atrocities that were committed by the Arabs, how they used to torture the people, how people were killed at the site. And that's why some of the areas have areas that are taken as stains. People believe that these are still stains of the blood, much as one knows that blood is something that can even be taken off by water, but there are spots that have those stains, which represent the blood that was shed at the site during the time of slave trade. And one of the key narratives that come out prominent is that despite the fact that we all had this thinking through the history that were taught that the British came in to stop slave trade, the people in the area believe that they are the ones who stopped slave trade in this area, as we shall see in the next audios that we have. And actually the naming of this place, we said that Fort Patiko is situated at Ajuru, which is now Patiko. It is as a result of the war that was fought to chase the Arabs away from the site. And then Sir Samuel Baker playing a key role in stopping slavery. So the key question here that we are yet to answer is, who really stopped slave trade? Is it the British under Sir Samuel Baker or the local people within the area? Because the local people believe that they're actually the ones who stopped slave trade and not the British, as they claimed that they had a humanitarian motive of coming here to stop slave trade and spread Christianity. Next, please. And so in this slide here, we see what I've done is to put the English version of what he's talking about because it is in Acholi. So as we listen to it, the story is what I've put on the side in those small words there. Let us play the video, please. We're not hearing it. Okay, I can just explain what this audio is about because I don't hear the.
Okay. Sorry, Elizabeth, I was on mute, so that's why you didn't hear it. Apologies. Let me try again. I think that's quite important we can make it work. Hold on.
Kita ini kakak ini mir ku beri ya. Era ku ber kater dar parwat maraj. Dokme pur cham. Macam ini cingin bel di muker mafod. Tino ni ikar badung daro kelu yaman ini. Kera duk mater tu. Ena gipimu dong kicam. Sino tamu ni inti kelu mama dia dari share meri. Wanga ngomong.
Before that, just a few explanations here. What he's trying to show is that when the Arabs came in with this slave trade, they used to torture people in such a way that they would make them bring in crops, and they believe that where they were pouring the crops, there was a kind of hole in that they will keep pouring the sim, and they will tell them, go back until this hole is filled. So they bring more, and yet they were telling them it's not enough. One wonders where the sim and all these other grains were going, but that is how they used to torture them. And eventually this made the people in the area to turn away from planting these kind of crops because they saw that the Arabs were torturing them and making them to plant them, and resorted to planting other crops such that they can be free from this torture and the mistreatment by the Arabs. Let's go on. So what we see in our next slide really shows Fort Patiko by 1972, showing some of the architectural features, how they looked like at that time before actually it was declared a national monument. As we can see from here, there's the ammunition store, which we're going to see it is physically having these structures are still there. At one point it said they were roofed, but the ones that are current there, they are not actually roofed. We can be able to detect the ammunition store, the millet store, and the sim store. Possibly in these millet stores and the sim stores, that is where when people would come in and bring their grains, they would be poured and they feel like, they are just disappearing and they are not filling it up. And eventually people decided to go away from doing that. We have the execution slab where there's this stone where they used to execute those slaves who could not attract maybe market because they were maybe thin, or those that were stubborn and all that. They had a prison area, and there was a seat where a baker would sit and watch from afar to see. So when you look at all this, one wonders whether really Sir Samuel Baker was here to represent the humanitarian move of stopping slavery, and yet you see that even within his, I would say his time period as the leader and the one in charge of Fort Patiko, we still see slave trade continuing within this area. So this is the kind of story which is coming out to show that much as the British claim to have come in Uganda, for instance, to stop slave trade, we see that they had ways of promoting this same kind of trade, unfortunately. Next, please. So this is Fort Patiko by 2022. When we did our drone survey, we still see the ammunition stores remains here. We have the remains of the millet stores, and then the sim store still represented. Just go on the next. And of course, okay, this is now giving us a very clear view of the site. By still this year, when we did the drone survey, we could not easily see on the sides, on the other sides, but there are remains of the trenches and ditches, meaning that the site was really gazetted properly, in that the slaves could not easily move away or escape from the site. And this having been named even after Sir Samuel Baker, who was supposed to be a champion of stopping slavery or slave trade within the site, that shows that there might have been other hidden motives as to why the British came in here, other than saying that like the common story which we see in our common archives is that they came in to stop slave trade, they introduced Christianity, and they were here on a humanitarian kind of motive. But that is Patiko by this year looking like that. Let's go on, please. And looking at these architectural structures and having in place an ammunition store, we have the grain stores and all these walls. Of course, these other on my right side, these were old pictures, but by 2021, initially when we visited the site, they were looking like that. So what does this all suggest? It suggests that the site was well gazetted. The site was really prepared, like a place where they would ensure that people do not easily get out, especially the slaves that were got. As we're going to see that they were really very gender sensitive, in that the female slaves were kept in a different portion from the female slaves. It's not that all the slaves used to stay in one place, as next please, as one might assume that, okay, there was no even minding about how the slaves were, how they used to behave at the site. No. And especially the vulnerability of the female and the children, whose story is usually not very clear, because one would assume that maybe slave trade was focused on mainly enslaving the men who were able-bodied, who would go and work. But the stories coming from Patiko suggest that actually on the site they even had an area which was clearly gazetted for keeping the females away from the male. Next, please. And so when you go to our third objective, I just picked some narratives from the people concerning the whole process and how the slaves were taken. There's this common story within the area that the Arabs used to come in, they used to force women to work for them. And they talk about, this story comes from someone who is a grandchild of Abedi, who was taken by the Arabs. So according to her, the husband of Abedi decided to die and follow his wife, because his wife had gone in, had been asked to go and work at this site. And in the process of sweeping the compound at Fort Patiko now, the Arabs got her, took her to their bathroom there. And then from there, when the other women came back, he realized that his wife was not there. And in the process of following up the wife, he was killed. The wife was actually told to smoke his body. It is said the wife was sexually harassed. And when she came back, she put aside her clothes. And according to this witness, not a witness actually, the person who informed us, shows that this torn piece of cloth was kept from that time onwards. And this marked the beginning of the war between the Acholi and the Arabs within the area. So this brings out some of maybe the atrocities or how women were tortured during slavery and especially slave trade at Fort Patiko. I know my time is not so much there. I'm sorry, let us go to the next. Okay, so still in relation to that and showing that the Arabs really were involved in these atrocities before Sir Samuel Baker came in, it is said the Arabs come in and settle, there were cells for the slaves, and these cells had ashes, and these ashes were kept within there. So within these cells, those who were victimized would be beheaded. These are just stories I picked. I could not play all the audios, but these are translations from the actually audios that we recorded during this time, showing that, yeah, many people were arrested, many people were killed at the site, and possibly these are some of the stories that we're trying to capture and bring out in order to archive these memories concerning slave trade. Next, please. So this is an area I talked about, and I said that according to the local people, where we see this lady standing, this was the portion where the female slaves, it was a unit for enslaving the females. But in this picture here, we see that, yes, much as they were enslaved, but still at a time when the abolition of slave trade took on, we can see that there was an emancipation. And one thing that comes out clearly is that there were women, there were children who were involved in this, who were enslaved actually as part of the slave trade, as you can see. And when you see the lady sitting here is most likely to be Baker's wife, Florence. If you get time and watch our video, which is online, which we had shared earlier on, you're going to see very nice pictures of Florence, who was the wife of Baker. So here sitting and with the ladies and children at a time when it seems they had been emancipated, and some of them are actually hugging Sir Samuel Baker here, the person in this picture. Next, please. On the other side, we have also the male slave unit. So this part of the site is taken as the area where the male slaves were kept. Next, please. And so later on, following those, the British come in, because the initial story is mainly centered on the Arabs, but later on we see the British come in, and according to the stories that we captured, we have the audio in Acholi, which we translated in English like this. They say that Baker also came following the other war when they fought, following the killing of one of the men who died because he was trying to rescue his wife. So following that, they were arrested, and Baker came in and followed up these people, and they kept at this place. But we see that some of these people would be sold, and some of their goods would be sent to as far as Gondokoro. So this shows that slave trade or the continued, and people had to sell the slaves outside to other countries, especially through Sudan, Egypt, and all that, which were at that time also part of the Equatorial Province. Next, please. And so why Sir Samuel Baker? Why is this fort called Sir Samuel Baker? Sir Samuel Baker, this is just brief about what he did and who he was. These are some of the pictures showing Sir Samuel Baker that we got from some of the texts that we consulted. And Sir Samuel Baker popularized this fort because in 1869, he served as a governor up to 1873. But most importantly, in 1872, he is said to have established this fort as a base for the suppression of slave trade. Of course, what we have to look at is, yes, he uses it as a base for suppressing slave trade. How much did he do to stop the slave trade? As the people within the area feel that actually it is them who stopped the slave trade and not the likes of Sir Samuel Baker, much as the fort was named after him. Next, please. And so following Sir Samuel Baker, we see the coming in of, according to the gentleman here, they believe that the Arabs, what he's going to say is actually what I translated here as the Arabs. Maybe just listen, just briefly.
Florence beta TV yeah. We had talked on that one where Mrs. Becker was praying. Is what he was trying to add.
Okay, next please. So that was simply showing that the Arabs were chased by Baker, confirming that yes, Sir Samuel Baker participated in the stopping of slave trade, much as still the local people also hold it that they were actually the ones who stopped slave trade. What we find in this area, and for many people, or maybe you might be online and you're going to find that people within this northern part of Uganda are using music in so many ways. Since the time of slave trade, as we see the suffering, the atrocities, the fighting in this area, this has gone on because this is one area that has been affected by war. Almost up to 2006, there's been fighting in this area. But it is really surprising in how they are using music to pass on a message, to bring people together, to heal the memories of war. And so we find that even during slave trade, we find that music was one of the, I would say, the instruments that were used to help people get rid of maybe some of those bad memories. As we can see, these are just scanned pictures from some of the texts, but it shows that music had its roots earlier on. As we're going to see the contemporary kind of music being played in the next slide, we find that in this area, people have played music, and we'll only have time maybe for the Bora dance. We have many of them. If you go on our page, you're going to find many of these dances, but I'll enjoy that one. Your volume, please. Don't hear. Okay. So, sorry about the volume. Okay, so as we wind up, the key question all that we bring out is that who really abolished the slave trade? In looking at Fort Patiko as a case study, it should be noted that it's just because we looked at Fort Patiko, but there's a whole trail of sites that are related to Fort Patiko, like Wedelai, that are all the way in the northern part of Uganda, and until we get the slaves out through Sudan and Egypt and the other places. Is it the British or the local people? From the narratives that we get in this area, the local people believe that they really participated fully, and the story of the local people ought to be brought out, showing the role they played in as far as stopping slave trade is concerned. And what is important here is that the Arabs during the time of slave trade, according to the narratives in this area, used not to pick the slaves mainly from within because they were staying within. So they would get the slaves from areas far away because they didn't want to enslave the people that were close to them, who are like part of them. Okay. So in conclusion, we are saying that some of the atrocities we see that were part of the slave trade have continued in northern Uganda, especially in the wars that took place up to 2006. There were many cases of abduction of women, girls, and all that were underage, especially during the Lord Resistance Army War. And Fort Patiko gives us a chance to document heritage, because one of the key things is that how do we define heritage? What do we take as heritage? Should we only look at heritage as only that good part of our past? What do we do with the bad, in quotes, dark, hurting heritage? How do we bring it out to the people without arousing the memories of let me say, the bad memories, memories of hatred, memories of war, but document it in a way that will make them heal the wounds.
Sorry, you're having trouble hearing you. The conclusions on the screen. Maybe we can move to responses, because for some reason you're cutting out. I don't know if Elizabeth can hear us. I might just stop sharing the screen and just send her a text. Elizabeth, can you hear us now?
Could Zahura mute, because there's it's quite a lot of background noise.
I think thanks. That's great. I think we just maybe give a second for Elizabeth to see if she can come back into the room. Because it would be good for her to obviously hear Mick's response. Just give that a minute. Hi, Mick.
Hi.
So we'll have a little bit less time for discussion, but I think that's okay. I might just, Liam, could you just drop her an email just to say that not to worry, but we'll just wait for her for a few minutes if she's okay. Thanks everybody for your patience. Sorry about this. This sometimes happens. Mick, everybody, did you get a chance to read the whole slide of the conclusions just while we wait, or should I put it back up?
I did, but I think probably good to put it back actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to put it back.
Okay, well, if she can't get it in, then, oh, here we are. Great, perfect. Elizabeth, can you hear us now? Oh, she's just reconnecting to audio. Hi, Elizabeth, can you hear us now?
I can hear. Sorry about it.
Sorry
I don't know
about.
what happened.
We've just had a look at all your conclusions. So if you're happy about going straight to responses, and thank you so much. So first, so thank you profusely. Thank you so much for that incredibly rich presentation, and from so many angles. It's really quite incredible how you managed to bring both the material, the archaeological, the historical, and the musical, and also movement. So I'm not going to be the first response. So Mick, when you're ready, look forward to your response.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elizabeth. It's fascinating. This sense of not only going back into reconstruction these histories, but this sense also that there's still this narrative from the late 19th century that seems to have not been unhinged, and I find that obviously really really important, but also fascinating the process of that. One thing, there's a few questions I've got more in terms of the response, in terms of because the dates, you're talking like Baker is the governor from 1869 to 73. And then he is basically in charge of the fort, and he's in this process of supposedly liberating the area from the slave trade, but the opposites have happened. That date is 1872 to 88. I'm just curious, the Turkish period before that. Can you give a bit more detail? Sorry, the Arab part I'm presuming is it the Ottoman Empire, or who? My history isn't very good about that part of it. Could you just throw some more light on that? What was that period of colonialization?
Should I answer one by one?
I mean, it depends if Mick, you want to ask all the questions together, and then Elizabeth can kind of coordinate them.
Okay, well, I'll do them all. That's the first question. I wondered how that relates, and in a sense, I think the biggest question I've got, because when you're talking about these oral transmissions, and with the person who was being videoed, you're talking about something that's going back, I can't count how many generations. Could you tell us more about how that transmission is working? Because it's fascinating. Is that a transmission that's been handed down from generation to generation? Is it something that, I presume it's quite, how do you say, it's quite a difficult process to find the people who have this knowledge, or is it somehow something that's quite freely available? Similarly, I think with the music that you talked about at the end, does that still, do those songs, does that music still exist in a way? Are there still traces of that, or has it been displaced into something else? I'm very interested in like what the traces that you're navigating are in a way, and especially the oral traces. I think that's fascinating. What the systems of transmission might be, for example.
Thank you so much for the comments. I'll begin with the first one concerning the Arab period. Slave trade, with the focus on Fort Patiko, should not be seen in isolation from the entire trade that was taking place in East Africa, especially as part of the long distance trade, which is connected to the East African coast. It's only that now, for purposes of this project, we are mainly looking at the Fort Patiko activities and all that. But as far as Uganda is concerned, the Arabs come in around the 1840s. And also, of course, as they come in, they are only not involved in the trade, but they are also looking at the religion. And maybe one may wonder why, much as the Arabs were, in my view, the first ones to come in as the foreigners with their religion, the British and later the French with their Catholic religion, these other religions are more prominent in Uganda compared to Islam. Maybe it has many followers compared to Islam. So I would say that concerning the period when the Arabs come in, they come in earlier than the period of Baker in Fort Patiko. On the issues of oral transmissions and how they are moving in from generation to generation, we find that this story of the lady who was harassed and the husband who was killed is a common story that we got from many informants. We find that a number of our video clips talk about this same story. And that's why this is still work in progress. That's why now we intend to go out and find out from the school children. Do the children also get this kind, how is the transmission being done, especially to the young children? So I would say that the stories, this is a common story which we see from many of the interviews that were conducted in this area, not an isolated case. Only that for this particular one that I tried to portray here in this presentation was from someone who actually claims to have linkage with this family of the people who were part of the slave trade. And lastly, on the issue of music, the music is not displaced, the music is alive. All those musical, we only played one, but we had several. The music is what we recorded actually starting in 2021, 2022, it is still going on. They have music for all generations and for different activities. We only played the word dance. They have music for the youth, basically. They have music which is mainly for the elderly, like in this word dance, when maybe the men are going to fight. That's why you see that they're even having those axes with them, showing like they have maybe like a weapon that they are using. And some of them, they are really also trying to show that they can protect the ladies in case maybe they married them because they are stronger. You can see they are having these kind of weapons. So what I can say is that music is still going on. It is being passed on from generation to generation. Yes.
So that's really like a folk tradition that's going back to at least that late 19th century period. It's a direct line. Could I just ask a little bit more, Lena? Okay. It's because actually what you were talking about, which I think is fascinating, with Mego, I think it's Mego Amu, is the story that you're referring to. It's about the torn cloth. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because that was also intriguing. It just needs, I'm just intrigued to know a little bit more about that. I mean, in the sense that somehow this, how do you call it? This talisman or whatever, this object became quite important.
Okay. This torn cloth, according to the informant, who claims that the lady was his great-grandmother, claims that they still keep this as like I would say a regalia or like a saying talisman, which they are still keeping, and he would say, I just eliminated those. I say, I even see it, it is still there. They claim that that cloth is the actual cloth that their grandmother had at the time she was harassed by the Arabs at Fort Patiko. So they still keep it, but maybe it is something that we need to pursue. What meaning do they attach to it? Why do they still keep it? How do they intend to preserve it? How are they passing it, this information maybe to the young ones to ensure that they keep this object or this, I would say maybe sort of artifact that they are still keeping up today.
And one other thing within that was that the illustration you showed of the emancipated women,
Yes.
With Florence Baker and Samuel Baker. I was just wondering what publication did that come from? What was that a part of? Was that a part of his memoirs or something, or was it part of his propaganda? Obviously,
it is part of Sir Samuel Baker's memoirs.
Okay.
Mm.
Is there much of a? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the old. I imagine it would have been the former colonial office. Are the records of? Are there records of that period within the, I don't know, the colonial apparatus in Britain? Is that also part of the project, or is that something you just need to push away? Or
it's not, we are not stretching up to the British museums and all that to find out this kind of information. Given the limitations of the project, we had to restrict ourselves to information we can get within Uganda and the archives that are within the country, but we did not go up to Britain to trace for this. I'm sure they should be having information concerning this, but we did not go up to that.
maybe that's something we could help with. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, also,
intriguing.
absolutely. So it's also important that you should know, if you don't already, Elizabeth, we do have another project no, this one wasn't in Uganda, was it? JC's project is something that would be really important to you, also because JC is based in the UK and she was looking at alternative records, but she is also, I think, just getting involved in supporting the Cambridge Library and the archives there. So she'll be very involved in library studies and archives, and she would be probably great. And we should try and see if we can get you up here to the UK to actually look at some of these. And I know that Nancy, who's also in the audience, has got similar kind of issues and thinking about missionary archives, both in Uganda and outside. That would be really important to get access to. Thanks very much for that conversation. We do have a few more minutes. I'm just wondering if there's anybody else, because I'm kind of holding back my questions. So I'm wondering if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question. And that's also if our other presenters and respondents also want to ask, please feel free to do so, or we can continue some of this afterwards. I don't see any. Okay, well, there's no raised hands at the moment. Can I just ask you, I mean, there's so many things that you touched on. So one of the things that I started with when I introduced you is about unfinished pasts. So what kind of thing would make this a more finished or something coming to terms with? You mentioned some questions towards the end about how do you consider these very difficult pasts and dark pasts on the one hand and allow people to speak about it, but without creating re-traumatizing events. So that's one thing. The other thing I was very interested in is the archaeological material. So notoriously, I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but the archaeological material, I mean, what are the details of those structures and their chronologies, I guess, that allow us to tell one kind of narrative or another and allows a different narrative that challenges the kind of very glorifying narrative that we get in the British sources, the way they're described. And I mean, also being an archaeologist, I realize how difficult that question is, but I'd love to hear from you from that really intricate studies that you were doing of the grain holding tanks and other kinds of things. If you could say just a little bit more about that. And my final question, which you don't have to answer all of them, is about, I mean, this is where I was hoping that Nelson might be here, because I'm just wondering how you create an exhibition, whether it's a traveling exhibition, a digital exhibition, or maybe a vocal exhibition, and some of this is already in your film, how do you
Mm.
display these different narratives without necessarily judging or having to come to a right or a wrong answer, right? So it kind of asks questions and continues the conversation rather than saying this is the right way. So just any of that, and I realize you may not have all the answers, that would be great. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Linda. In terms of the dark past, I think it also goes back to the digital exhibition without necessarily hurting the people. That's why you find that we are really focusing so much on the music, because that may make people not realize, as they keep enjoying the tunes and all that, the message is coming out without necessarily many people maybe really paying attention to the message, and they pay attention maybe to the dance and all that. So that's why we are mainly focusing on the music and how this music can be used to pass on these memories, as people enjoy the music without necessarily thinking about actually the meaning, and they just enjoy the tunes, but yet the message is going out. That's what I can answer for now. Like you said, I may not answer everything now. For the case of the archaeological materials, I agree with you. The architectural structures can actually be used as material that we can use really to showcase what happened at Fort Patiko in as far as slave trade is concerned, other than looking out for materials, let me say metal objects like chains and all that. At least we're lucky that at Fort Patiko, there are structures clearly demarcated, and we can see, okay, this is the slab where they were being tortured and all that, which can help us to come up with the story of slave trade.
Well, thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. And I think that the next presentation will also link into a lot of these subjects. So perhaps we can also pick up some of the strands from yours there. I'm just thinking about time. So if I could move on to our next presenters, if that's all right. And Elizabeth, I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes as well, and be really keen to see how you develop some of these ideas. So the next presentation will be by Hawa, Mkwela, and it'll be it's called Mental Map, a way to access information from Maji Maji war victims in Southern Tanzania. So very much working the foundations of the kind of things that Elizabeth's been presenting, and I think also responding to some of Mick's questions from a different approach and from a different context. And Hawa is a lecturer and social sciences researcher, as well as a consultant. She has helped the universities develop new curricula, for example, in geography courses at Ardi University in Tanzania, and BA and education curricula at Tumaini University in Dar es Salaam College, Tudarco. Her research interest is on education development, environmental management and conservation, geographical information systems, agricultural development, land justice, land use, family, health, gender and childhood, women, economic empowerment in urban and rural Tanzania. And she, as taking all this on board, is not simply through academic research, but she's also involved in programs that seek to empower women, especially low-income earners, by providing them with the skills and means for establishing and or running a successful business. And responding to Dr. Mkwela will be Elizabeth Wright, who is an artist and fine art lecturer at Central St. Martin's at the University of the Arts in London. Her art practice is centered on working with the public realm, with art commissions, both temporary and permanent. And her recent projects include developing community toolkits that enable the use of offline, hyperlocal wireless networks for hosting and registering their own histories. And as part of her investigation into the pedagogy of sculpture and the copy, her current project, Studio N, is a virtual shared studio space and research project in Art Education Commons, working with the primary, secondary, and higher education art sectors in the UK. So you also crisscross very much on that kind of engagement between the practice, the academic, and the community. I look forward to your presentations, Hawa. So please do feel free to share your screen when you're ready. Hawa, can you please unmute? And also maybe put your, if you can put your presentation on presentation mode, that would be great.
Okay, right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. That's great. But you might want to put your presentation onto presentation mode, then we can have it full screen.
Right. Should I do that?
Yeah, that would be brilliant. If that's all right with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Still...
Mm-hmm.
That looks great.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to be very brief because of time. I'm presenting on mental maps, a way to access information from Maji Maji war. I prefer to call them survivors, not victims, in southern part of Tanzania. My outline is, we'll start with the introduction, the main objective of the project, some methods which were used. I'll present the maps and a brief conclusion. I'll briefly define what is mental maps. It's a perception of people which is in their minds and can be brought up in a piece of paper through stories, drawing, etc., to describe what is preserved in their minds or brain. So in this case, we were trying to bring these ideas from Maji Maji war victim and present it in a map to get their views on how they saw the war, how they can map the war, because there is no map that shows areas which were affected by the war from the indigenous people. The study area is in Tanzania, the southern part of Tanzania. I have a Maji Maji war map. This is Tanzania. The war was spread throughout, and my focus today will be the southern part of the country. We mapped 3 regions, Songea, Mkwela, and Lindi. And as I said earlier, the main objective was to map the war in local people's perspective. We have maps drawn by Germans, but this is very important for how to map how people view the war, how they remember about the war. So we used different methods. Mapping is one of the main methods. Some drawings during our interviews and focus group discussion. We allow people to draw what they remember. Observation and coordinate taking was also part of our methods. We had very nice focus group discussions with men and women. We separated men and women, and then we put them together to confirm what they've identified. The main objective was to identify the war locations they remember, and also to hear stories behind the areas. So mainly the focus group discussion and interview was to give meaning to the identified locations or places. Out of that, we had 3 maps, each for one region. This is in Lindi Kilwa. I won't give stories behind all the locations. I'll just pick a few. For example, here, this is Nandembo Lake. We after our group discussion, we visited this place. This is where they used to, there's a tree that was used to develop poison that were put in the arrows for Maji Maji war. So this was one of the most important location to for the participants. And also, briefly, Nangoma was where it's a cave where people used to hide, especially women and the old, and also the sick. They were hiding in that area. So briefly, I can just speak about the two locations which were identified. In total, we had about 50 locations, but we mapped only 24 because we had to confirm the location by either going relating the stories from both group discussions, men and women together. So we eliminate some of the locations that were not very much important to the project. This is the second map, which is in Ndanda. You can see the location here. This is a map of Tanzania, and it's far down the south. Mtwara is very close to Mozambique. Here we went to the king's home. We believe this man was there during the war, but I think looking at the time when the war started in 1905, I'm sure maybe he wasn't even born. If he was born, he was too young to remember the war. But of course, he had very nice stories about the war. He knew a lot about the war. So we visited this man. Now he's the current king, Mchekenje. We had a group discussion and mapping section near his home. And later on, we went to another lady who is related to him, not as old as him, but she had also very rich information about the war. And for Ndanda, I'll pick the Lake Mtitimo. We visited this place. This is the place where Europeans came first, and Mtitimo means drowning. So there was a pregnant woman who drowned in this lake, and that's why it is called Lake Mtitimo. Mtitimo means drowning, and first European came there, and they normally carry a cross every year to remember the date. But eventually Europeans did not live here. They lived somewhere down in Ndanda. That wasn't the best location, but it is important for the local people. The third map was in Songea, this part here, very close to Lake Malawi. There are so many locations identified by the people here. We had a very rich discussion, and I'll pick maybe two locations. The Hanging Tower. This is where heroes were hanged. Here. The region prepared or remembers this war every year in this area, and most of these locations are close by. There's a prison where they kept Africans who were caught during the war, and there's a court nearby here, and they also have German's graveyard. And also, we didn't go to this place called Chandamali Cave. This is where the chief was hiding during the war. Yeah, I think those were the few important places. We have some pictures, but I cannot show them right away of the locations. Briefly, I would say the war started at the same time in different locations, so it is hard to conclude where it actually started. But so far, we believe it started in Lindi, and news spread very fast to other locations, and they started the war either by killing the Germans or riot or anything. So I'll conclude by saying it is very important to conduct an extensive study of this place, because the war was distributed all over. We need time to collect the locations and confirm their meaning, and also perhaps put all respondents together to come up with one big map that at least will show the extent of this war. And also it is very important to document the war before all this information is lost. I believe for us geographers and historians, it's very important to at least document this war in a map, and which can be used later on our next generation. Briefly, I'll say thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions, because I didn't have time for the presentation. I hope there will be more questions for me.
Thanks very much, Hawa. And I appreciate the timing as well. But if you did have things that you wanted to show, we do have a few more minutes if you'd like. If you have
Okay. Yeah, maybe I can have more questions so that I'll show things by responding to the questions, like photos and other things people might want to hear or see.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I know maybe I don't know if you need to keep sharing your screen for a moment, or you'd like to stop sharing while Liz asks some questions, and you could share again when you're ready if you'd like to show some. Would that work? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. I mean, it's amazing to see that I think some of Mick's questions that he was asking are also very relevant here. And so there's a nice intersection. But Liz, I will go to you to hear your response. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hawa. I mean, just an incredible mapping exercises, series of exercises that are just sort of so rich in process. You started by explaining the act of mental mapping, and you described this sort of very flat process of kind of paper to cloth, and what you've shared at the end is a series of reprographic maps. I guess I'm really interested in your pipeline, you know, in terms of the strategies and approaches of how you really invited people to tap into their memory knowledge, because, you know, mapping is so personal and it's so open to interpretation. So I'm kind of interested in the sort of the bits in between that maybe you have, that it would be really interesting to see, you know, how you invite people to share and to remember. That's my first question. The second question is really, how did the groups arrive at a consensus? Because again, what you're sharing is this very kind of clear, you know, concise map, but I imagine in terms of the kind of extent of your mapping that there's a lot of discussion, and there's a lot to be kind of processed. My third question is really how the different gender-based groups, you know, how did they approach the mapping process? Was it different in any way? And again, my fourth question is, did you discover kind of more granular and alternative mapping strategies that existed already within the group that perhaps kind of embodied, you know, more kind of shared community knowledge, perhaps?
Thanks very much, Liz. Just give a second to Hawa to note that down.
Yeah, I was writing the last thing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. What were the strategies we used to select the people? We informed the local leader, and also Nancy had done a lot of research on Maji Maji war, and we got respondents from the local leaders, at least people who have the knowledge of the war. And also we were limited to at 30 people, so we didn't invite many people. I wish, that's why I'm suggesting we should have an extensive study where everyone can come in, and we have more time where we could have more respondents, and bring all the stories together and confirm the stories and locations. I've realized the most important part of this location identification is to confirm the location. And also linking to the gender question, that if it was different from men and women, yes, most of the time women will bring out stories of where they used to cook, where they took care of the sick, while men will focus on where the arrows were made, who was killed first, how they traveled from one location to the other. And also they mainly focus on talking about the person who was the hero to them, who developed the medicine. So because women were focusing on how they took care of the old, the sick, and how it was difficult for them to get food and to hide, while men will focus on where they got the arrows, where they got the medicine, and how the news was spread, and who killed the European, and those stories. And later on, when we bring them together, I didn't expect it in Kilo. I thought due to their culture that they're mainly Muslim, women will be shy, but it wasn't like that. They all came together and remind each other, and it was a very serious, hot discussion, and like, no, yeah, it was here and it was there. So eventually we combine all these stories and get what we got. And that I've answered. And you said there is a lot to process. Yes, because the most difficult part for us is to go and was to go and confirm the location. It wasn't easy because they used to go with us, maybe a group of 4 or 5, go to the location and take pictures and so on. So it took more time. So I think it will be important for researchers to spend more time and collect, first hear the stories, collect the location, visit them one by one, and later on to put them in the GPS. And of course, mapping was also a very difficult process, but we used AHRC to make it easier. I totally agree there is a lot to process, but bringing all the methods together, discussions and drawing, some people drew, and the stories we got, we managed to identify the most important location. But as I said, more should be done. And an alternative strategy, yes, people drew, some people drew. There are people who couldn't see the blind, so they would just tell stories. And there were people who couldn't write, so they would maybe draw something. So all these methods were used during the discussion and put together and identify the important locations.
So really, you've
answered all.
Yeah, really, you've described a kind of mapping of care within the women, which is so rich in terms of how, as a sort of an alternative map of care of.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. So yeah, to have a map of like how women mapped Maji Maji war, right?
Yeah, through care, which is what you described
care,
there. And then just wondered if you could say a little bit more, maybe it ties into the previous Elizabeth's presentation around cloth, because you introduced cloth at the beginning. And wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit more.
Okay, I have some pictures. For example, in in one of the hideouts, the cave. They used to do local tradition where they call it ngoma, where they initiate young girls and boys to adulthood. So we found some clothes over there in the cave, and so they normally do that in those caves, which is the main hideout in Kilwa. It's called Nangoma cave. We didn't get the location of the cave, inside the cave, because the GPS was not working inside, but we got the location of the entrance, and that's why it is presented here. Let me show you in a map. Now, where is it? Here. So at the entrance, there are some clothes that they used to wear during these rituals, and that's all I can say about clothes at the moment. But there are other instruments which we saw at the cave. Did I answer your question, or I got it wrong?
No, I guess it was, what I was interested in is how, because this is such a precise mapping exercise, how you arrived at consensus amongst the group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to bring them together, and as I told you, it was a very hot discussion. They mainly remind each other and add more locations. Yeah, no, it started here. No, it was like this. No, it was at the end of the day, they all come up with one answer. It wasn't like a discussion where they disagree. They only reminded each other and eventually agreed to where it was. And for example, we went to the lake, and the lake isn't there, but they all confirmed that there was a lake. And they had a story where Nandembo means an elephant. So there are elephants, a lot of elephants during that time. Yeah, we all got together, men and women, I think from this, we were at a certain school around here. So we walked to the lake, and we saw the location. So the lake wasn't there, but they all agreed that this is where it was.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you be able just to stop sharing screen for a minute? Because I just
Yeah,
want to...
yeah.
So really, I just want to open up the floor to some other questions and discussions. Whether it's raising questions about that was also my question, thinking about dissensus within the project, Liz, your point about how do you come to consensus, and that, I mean, one of the things we were trying to understand more through the project, Hawa, is that if you don't come to the consensus, how do you make that not a problem? So how do you have stories which can coexist, especially about sites? I mean, going back to your discussion with Liz about the very different ways that women's stories are mapped onto the landscape, perhaps, versus men's stories. I mean, I don't know if Liz, this is what you were thinking within your question, but to almost have like an overlay, we have one mapping according to the men and another mapping according to the women, and see how they line up, or maybe they have in between spaces. And then you can also think about how that correlates with the topographic mapping, maybe, of the geographic sites. And I was really interested in your very last response, you mentioning that the lake is not there and that there were many elephants. So it contains all these other kind of pasts of the natural history pasts. And I'm curious as to, would it have been the men or the women who noticed that? Maybe that's not important. Maybe it's not divided between those groups. But I'm just also really interested in who's noticing what. I mean, I've got some other questions, but I'm just wondering, does anybody else in the room? I don't know if people want to maybe turn on their videos for the discussion. That would be nice. I know some people.
Just a second, I'm putting on the lights.
Yeah, sure. I know some people struggle with connectivity, but if you're not, it'd be great to have some faces in the room. Hi, Horst, nice to see you.
Yeah.
So yeah, so Hawa, in any of those questions, that'd be great.
Yeah. Yes. Now you're bringing out very important questions. Our main idea was to bring them together, not like who did what in opposed to who didn't do what. As also Elizabeth said, we need a care map. So this is very important to see how women map Maji Maji war differently from men. But what we had was a very common understanding of these issues. Yes, maybe men forgot to mention about where women got food and other care things. But when we brought them together, they came out and say yes, this is where the women were doing this, and this is where we took the soldiers who were hurt, and this is where the old were kept. So it was like reminding each other what happened, and men and women also. Some women didn't know some of the things men knew, so we all brought them together, and no one said no, this didn't happen, but they just it was a reminder to the other group that this happened as well.
That's just on that comment. I mean, it sounds to me like your reasons, or at least what resulted from you having these separate groups, is probably a little bit maybe unexpected. Would that be right? So that nice reminding, maybe if you brought them together right from the beginning, you wouldn't have had women maybe give a chance to talk about these things, or other way around. But because they had together, they were kind of a strong to say this is also important. That's really fascinating to hear.
Yeah, the reason why we separate them, because women tend to be shy in most of group discussion, especially in Muslim societies, and Cuba being one of them. So sometimes women will be just quiet because of their men in the presence of men. That's why we thought it is very important to have them in a separate group and then bring them together. Although we didn't see this much in Kira, but in other research, due to their cultures, women do not speak in front of men. No. So like if you put them together at the beginning, you get nothing. Yeah. So that was the main reason why we separated them. Yeah. But again, I'm taking the suggestion that to have a map, a care map, that will only show what women think about the war, and again have a map for men, and could be nice, and
children when you interview,
a cultural map or something like that. In addition to the physical location.
Exactly. Yeah. And Mick, maybe Mick has a question as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Again, it's similar to one of the things that intrigued me about Elizabeth's presentation is that when in the time frame you're looking at, you're going back to what, 1905, 1907. That's several generations, 3-4 generations back. I'm wondering, while you're collecting the stories, in a sense, and it's interesting this distinction between the accounts that come through the men, the accounts that come through the women. I'm wondering also, are you able to pick up how the stories are being transmitted? Is it through, I don't know, is it through community? Is it through family? I'm really intrigued how this transmission works, because it's obvious from a lot of the other Maji Maji material that we've looked at in Imagining Futures, that the Maji Maji War was a massive, it still is a massive memory, cultural memory. So I'm very curious to know about this transmission.
Yeah, I'll take an example of Ndanda, which is in Mkwela, where we visited these two old survivors, I'll call them. And we thought the man was there during the war, but he wasn't there. He's probably not 127 years. He's supposed to be, and if he was there, he was very young. But they're able to remember what they were told by their grandparents. And for example, this man was a king, and he inherited from his grandfather, who was also a king, and he fought the war. So they have stories from their grandparents about the war. And again, from there, we went to visit another relative, also very old. She was very old, but not as old as the other, the king. She told us the same story that my grandmother told me what happened. I wasn't there, but my grandmother told me this and this and this happened. And happened when my mom was pregnant for me. And yeah, so they come from their memories and stories which were told by them, by their grandparents mainly. Yeah.
Thank you, Hawa. And I see Horst has hand raised as well, which would be great to hear from him. Just to connect on this last point, one of the things we're hearing constantly through very different projects across Imagining Futures is the incredibly important role of grandparents and the access and the time of people to have time with grandparents, meaningful time, and the importance of having that time in special locations and sites that activate that memory. I mean, that is something we really want to think about carefully when we think about egalitarian archival practices, methods. I think thinking into the future and manifestos about that relationship, which I think is, well, I don't know, maybe not highlighted in these things. So yeah, so thank you very much for bringing that out. Horst, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for those presentations. As you might deduct from my name, I have a Namibia connection. And that Namibia connection, you raised the question of the war graves of German soldiers. And my question is, have you established who interred those soldiers? Was it people who were victors at a certain stage of the war against the Germans, or was it by the Germans themselves? And I raise that because it speaks to the question of care. Part of my family are Namakwa, and I found in a text of a German war journal that in one of the battles, the Germans were defeated, and they a number of them were killed, and they were buried by the Namakwa victors and buried in a very dignified way. The way the report reads, the dignification was not least important because the one with the highest military office got the best grave, whatever that's supposed to mean. But and then I have also family who are Damara, and they live in a gorge where the very first battle between German and Damara soldiers took place, and in 1897, and 4 German soldiers were killed. And this part of my family have looked after those war graves to this day. And I'm talking to the issue of care and to compassion and it's just another way of pursuing an ethical aspect in all of this, because otherwise it's just who combated with whom, but there are other underlying issues as well. It's more a comment maybe than a question, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, in Songea, the government is also helping to take care of the graves. Yeah, of course, the German graves are better than the local graves. Yeah, so those were Germans who were killed during the war. Yeah, either they just die or because they were killed by Africans to just start the war. I think the killing was done to start the war, because if you think logically, how did this happen everywhere at the same time? Because the war spread almost all over the country, and it started by either uprooting the plants or killing of the Germans. So it means there was I don't know how the information was spread that fast. That okay, now we should kill the Germans or we should do this, but later on in Songea, they take care of the graves, as you said, and in other parts. I wonder if you're suggesting should you have a map of care that is taking into consideration of how the monuments are taken care of?
If I may respond, Elena, I just I'm not suggesting very much other than to say that you know, these are not just battles between people, and now we have graves and some stories, but the people that were at the receiving end of this war, they still conducted their values and their ethics and their morals in various ways. So I'm just trying to give another granular dimension to them, and to the extent that you can establish and speak to that also, I think it gives another dimension of richness to it.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, it is very important to add that into our research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Is there any other questions or comments and responses to some of this or methodologies? One of the, I mean, if somebody does put up your hands, but we have a few more minutes. One of the things, there's three two of them are very interrelated things. One very small question I had, and two big ones, I'll ask them together. One is about, did the women speak about heroizing? I'd really be interested in that, because you mentioned Nancy, and some of the work that Nancy's been doing in the Maji Maji War is trying to rethink what heroes mean, and not just those men that were killed that are represented in sculptures. And I think from what you've told us, there could be really interesting different ways of thinking about heroizing. And what does a woman hero look like who's not, if you'd like, heroized or did the same kind of act as a man would do? So it's not about standing up in the front about it. What are the other forms of heroization? I'd love to hear about that. And the other things are kind of thinking a little bit into the future. So thinking about, how does one activate? So once you create this map, how does that get activated for the kind of memories? And I know Liz and Mick and our Central St. Martin's colleagues in particular, but also others, think about this all the time and the tools around that. So it'd be great to keep that conversation going, to see what other kind of methods we can think about together, especially if we're now also Horst has introduced this other form of care map that you've been talking about. And so in terms of that kind of activating, I was also wondering about the commemoration that happens at the locations? Because it sounds like some already have rituals established, and there are already kind of either monuments through practice, so events that happen all the time, or other kinds of markings that allow one to see something happen here, but other sites that really nobody would know something happened there. And how important is it actually to keep those sites without fixing them at the site, but to allow different people to both forget, to reuse sites in different ways, but other people to remember? So I'm particularly interested in that because I think recently there's been a lot of discussion, definitely in the UK, but other places, about how you fix memorials, and especially memorials of trauma in places, and whether that's always something that's a positive thing or not. So, again, these are very big questions, and it really is just a way to tie what you're talking about to what Elizabeth has mentioned and other projects that we have, and we're kind of answering them together. So don't feel like you have to have the final answer to any of those.
Yeah, thank you again. Women heroes. Women knew the medicine. They knew how to take care of the sick and the wounded. So I think those were some of, we can call them heroes for that, though maybe it isn't been considered as being a heroic act, but taking care of the wounded is I think it is being part of the war, and because they were healed from these women. And also I think there was a woman hero in Songea. She also participated in the war. She was very strong. I forgot her name. She's remembered, but there are so many other things women did, but they are not taken into consideration. It is also very important to put them. And also you've mentioned the locations that are not marked. For example, the Mtitimo Lake and other places, there is nothing there. Or the Nandembo Lake, where they say there are a lot of elephants, and it was very important. That's where the medicine came from. It is not marked, or no tourists who be taken there anyway to visit the location, because there's nothing important there. So it is very important to locate all these places and mark them and remember them in some way, including all the women who participated in the war. Okay. I totally agree with you. Yeah. Did I answer all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other questions, the bigger ones, are for us to keep talking about together. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a final question?
I remember now, like how can we use other strategies, methods in mapping activities, right? I think this is what we can discuss, and I can also take the points and see how I can improve my projects. Like, how can we add into the mapping activities activity to make it more rich, or maybe easier to identify the places, the important places.
Yeah, and also when you have the actual map, what happens to it as an object, and that's, I think, the kind of thing. Rakai, I don't know if you have a question or not.
Actually, I do not have a question, but rather I have some of the additions, and starting with that, the position of women, especially in this Maji Maji war. So women, for me, and I argue together with the Hawa Mkwela, they also participated fully. And when you go there to the Maji Maji Museum Memorial, Maji Maji Memorial Museum, you find one of the names that are listed there. One of that is Mkomanile. Mkomanile was the Induna, and she was very fully participating in this war. If you look at the names that are there described in the Maji Maji Memorial Museum. But again, recording these things, or rather finding out of this information, especially on this memory, is a trick thing. It's a trick thing. but the methodologies that Hawa Mkwela has employed for me, I think they are well. And I was reading one of the article entitled "The Archaeology of Myth." The Archaeology of Myth. This article is trying to show how we can argue, how we can correct these mythical stories and to integrate them in the archaeological research, and they have been employed somewhere, and they have yielded very good results. So for me, I think this is a nice project, and actually I have got some of the tips that I would also use in my research. So it's a nice one. Thank you. That was my comment.
Thanks very much, Baraka. And you just, I see Liz has a question, and you've just reminded me that actually at Songea Museum, one of the educators there, or one of the curators, she's working on that woman, on Kamaneli. So it might be, if you don't know who she is, we might find, I think Nancy will have her contacts, and it'd be great, or maybe Baraka, you even have her contacts, it'd be great to get in touch. And Liz, you have a question. Unmute, Liz. Liz, you got to unmute.
So you spoke at the start about mind mapping, and you described it as a process of paper to cloth to map. And my understanding when you said that was that these are, materials that people have at home, whether it's bringing their mind or they're bringing cloth, that actually that's a form of, collective mapping. It's contingent, it's a process. And my kind of sense of what you've described here is that it's it's an ongoing process, but it's the bringing together of people, it's the bringing together of the paper, of the cloth, that are the triggers, or that come, they're a kind of if you like, a contingent memorial or mapping that takes place in that moment of bringing it together.
I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah. Just bring everything together from the brain, from the cloth, and put everything together so you have something tangible and memorable to keep in the museum and share with others. And more importantly, today you've spoken about adding the map of care, or what Baraka also said, from the myth, and you can develop another map of myth, and so we can do a lot. We can use many methods to map the war, or not only the war, or other historical moments. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We're now really running out of time, so unless somebody has another question that they think would be really important to contribute now, do raise your hand. But otherwise, I think we're going to conclude this. But just on this last point that you were talking about, it reminded me of the way people talk about quilts. I don't know if you know, there's a lot of quilting traditions. Yeah, which is all about bringing little bits of cloth together and collectively. I mean, it sounds like that's what you were describing, is making a quilt. Which is metaphoric as well. But what's also important about it is precisely that word catalyst. So it's about the trigger, as I think that's the word Liz used, and you used the word catalyst. You don't know where it's going to go, and you don't bring the object for a specific story, but you bring what you have. And that triggers the story through the collective mapping together of this quilt. Now, what happens to that quilt at the end, of course, is, again, the kind of questions I was asking is, well, what happens to that map as a quilt? And I mean, the museum may be one place for it, or if you'd like, a marking of the event of making of the quilt is something that's important to record. But it'd be interesting for us to think together about, how do you ensure that it doesn't get it's not only in a museum, but something that moves and continues with the story. And sometimes quilts that stay at people's houses, or that kind of mapping that stays at a person's house, almost has a different kind of value and story wealth and meaning, because it is located somewhere that isn't an institution. So I think in our project, we're also talking a lot about the role of institutions, both about as being custodians of stories and so on. But yeah, I think It'd be really interesting to know about that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I take it as a comment, a very good one. We all need to figure out how the end might look like, and to discuss how are we going to archive this. Perhaps the most important question is, do we take it to the museum or we leave it where it is? And how can it be taken care if it is where it is? And I think those are the questions historians and archaeologists should take into consideration, how to take care of this information, like which is already collected and through a very hard work. So how do we take good care of this? I don't have the right answer, but I thought as a normal person, like we keep things in a museum. I'm not sure if it's the right place, or leaving it at the location where it is the best method. Perhaps one of you can contribute to this. Which is the best way to store all this information after now we've collected and made this very nice blankets, different colorful pieces. How do we keep it and protect it?
Yeah, I think that's I think that sounds like a question that's for us together to be trying to deal with in the next year and a half at least, and going on. But I think it's not, it doesn't, I don't know if it necessarily has to be one or the other. I mean, you could have something in a museum or a repository that's digital, but also something else that maybe the care of it is the physical and material is part of it, but there's another kind of care, which is what you and Elizabeth have been talking about, and Mick has asked a lot of questions about, which is how does that carry on that story? So how do we use the quilt as a catalyst through time? So it's not something that has to come to an end and stop, but how it projects and allows for other storytelling beyond that, and maybe connects with stories from very different contexts. I don't know if anyone from the gang who deals with this a lot, and mobile exhibitions and dynamic non-ending exhibitions that don't have an end. Maybe we can think about that together.
Maybe to put it in a curriculum.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. That's a great.
So that children could learn about these things, and it keeps on going. It's one way. I don't know about other methods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our conversation. So thank you everybody very much for our presenters and all the commentators who've had a chance to ask questions, and our respondents. And we look forward to the next dialogue next week on Tuesday. And we're soon coming to the end of these, which is in some ways great, because it means that the next stage is happening. So all of you will take things forward, and there'll be new kind of projects coming on board. So thank you all very much for your time and for your energies and creativity.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good evening for you too.
Bye. Liam, if we could stop recording.
Bye.
Great.
Bye.